Welcome to the second episode of Sir Philip Sidney. In the first episode, friends, we discussed about how Sir Philip Sidney was the first critic of English literature. We also tried to learn in the first episode how Sir Philip Sidney tried to inspire English poetry and English poets to follow the Greeks and the Latins, the Greeks and the Romans particularly, so that English poetry could also achieve the greatness, the height, the zenith at which the Greek and the Roman poetry had arrived. But then at the same time, Sir Philip Sidney also had this difficult task of upholding the charm, the absolute rhythmical structure of the English poetry. However, friends, before we ended the last episode, we learnt about a very important and a significant movement that started taking place in the Elizabethan age, and that movement was a protest against poetry. Many critics began to attack poetry, and we learned in the first episode that Stephen Gosson was one of them. He in fact wrote a treatise, an article called School of Abuse, which he dedicated to Sir Philip Sidney. If you remember, friends, the last slide in our last episode, I tried to tell you that when Sir Philip Sidney wrote Apology for Poetry, what was he basically trying to do in that particular book? So friends, let us go to the last slide of the first episode. Here it is on your screens. What was Sir Philip Sidney trying to do in Apology for Poetry? These were the three things that he was trying to do, friends. 1. Defend poetry against all attacks. 2. Advocate the following of and imitation of the classicists. And 3. Retain the charm and purity of the native English language. Friends, if you remember, this was the last slide in our first episode of Sir Philip Sidney. I will just begin to explain a little. So friends, these were the three major tasks that Sir Philip Sidney had when he began to write Apology for Poetry. Whenever something has to be defended against an attack, and against an attack which was as strong and vehement as brought about by Stephen Gosson, friends, we have to be very clear about one thing. We have to really understand how to begin the defense. Now, Sir Philip Sidney was not a lawyer by profession, but he was definitely a logician. And he uses logic in order to defend poetry against all attacks. How does he begin to do that? He first of all establishes the greatness of poetry. But before we come to the greatness of poetry and before we come to what he was defending poetry and how he was defending poetry, most importantly, friends, let us take a look at the slide wherein we come to know about the attack of Stephen Gosson. So let's go to the next slide. There on your screen, friends, you will find perhaps the most important slide of this episode. Stephen Gosson had attacked poetry on 4 major points. Number 1, a man could employ his time more usefully than in poetry. 2, poetry is the mother of lies. 3, it is the nurse of abuse. 4, Plato had rightly banished poetry from his ideal commonwealth. We could also call the commonwealth as the republic. Now, as you can see on your screen, friends, these are 4 extremely strong and very serious attacks against poetry. I'll just try to explain this a little. So friends, when Philip Sidney comes up with this kind of defense against such serious attacks, he first has to establish the greatness of poetry. Unless and until Sir Philip Sidney establishes the greatness of poetry, how will he be able to defend it? And as I just told you a few minutes ago, Sir Philip Sidney uses the method of a logician. He uses logic in order to support his defense of poetry. So friends, let's go back to the next slide on our screens. Look at how Sir Philip Sidney begins to defend poetry. Look at the first bullet point on the screen. Sidney calls poetry the oldest branch of learning. Now this is very important, friends. It is the oldest branch of learning. By learning here, I mean knowledge. So if poetry is one of the oldest branches of knowledge, certainly reading or writing poetry will definitely not make it a wastage of time. Come to the second bullet point. He compares, that means Sir Philip Sidney compares poetry with other branches and establishes the former's superiority. Now this is something very important that Sir Philip Sidney has done. He has compared poetry with various other branches of knowledge or of learning. Let us take a look at these branches. Look at the first point. Poetry has more charm than philosophy. I'm sure, friends, all of us will agree that philosophy is a rather dry subject. Very interesting, but then it is quite dry. But poetry in comparison is definitely more charming. It has emotions, it has sentiments, it has action, it has feelings of patriotism, nationalism. So definitely poetry has more charm than philosophy. Look at the second point on our screens, friends. Poetry is superior to history by its universal appeal. This, friends, is extremely important. I will just try to explain this a little. So friends, when we are discussing the history, we are generally discussing the history of a given geographical place, or maybe a tribe, a race, a community, a region, a nation. Therefore, history becomes limited, confined only to that space, only to that geographical location. However, poetry does not have any such boundaries. Poetry is limitless. What, for instance, a poet like Shakespeare has said or written in England was true in the 16th century, it is true today, and more importantly, it is even true in England, in Germany, in Brazil, in America, in China, in India. So the universal appeal of poetry is at such a wide scale, history cannot compare. How? Let me just give a couple of examples. Let us go back to the slide. I have used two quotes, one by John Keats and one by William Shakespeare. Look at the Keats poetic lines. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. Remember all the lyrics, friends, all the songs that you are very fond of. I'm sure most of these songs that you are extremely fond of are definitely those that tell of saddest thought. Now, Keats writing these lines in England is so true in Germany, in the US, in Africa, in India, in Thailand, in Belgium, everywhere. Look at Shakespeare's quote, which is from his very famous play Romeo and Juliet. What's in a name? That which we call a rose, by any other name would smell as sweet. So these two are just very simple quotes that I am offering, friends, lines from poetry, simply to give examples about the universal quality of poetry. Let's come to the next slide, friends. This is point number 3, how Sir Philip Sidney establishes the greatness greatness of poetry. Look at that. Unlike the sciences, poetry contains moral values, which makes it superior. Friends, all of us, we know that science deals only with details. 2 hydrogen atoms plus 1 oxygen atom will make H2O, which is water. It talks about acids and bases, it talks about procedures, it talks about experiments. Science is methodical in nature. It is scientific in nature. It does not contain moral values. Poetry contains moral values, and therefore poetry is superior to the sciences. Come to the 4th point on the screen. Law. Now this is the last branch with which Sidney is comparing poetry. Law gives importance only to civic rules, but poetry encourages basic human goodness. It is a very important point, friends. Law will teach us what to do and what not to do, but it is only poetry which will encourage the basic human goodness inside a person. I will just like to take half a minute here, friends. Each one of us as human beings, we have an essential goodness inside us. What encourages, which branch of learning encourages that goodness in us to come out and convert itself into honesty, into generosity, into kindness, into helping others, into being kind to others? According to Sir Philip Sidney, it is poetry that helps us bring out our goodness inside us and try and make this world a better place to live in. Again, friends, let us take a couple of quotes to prove these points of Sidney. Let's go back to the slide. See, famous lines by Robert Frost. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Look at the 3rd point. What does Sidney say? Unlike the sciences, poetry contains moral values, which makes it superior. Friends, look at these lines by Frost. But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Why do you think Robert Frost is saying this? Because he has lot of work to do before he dies. God has sent him with a purpose on this earth, and therefore he has to finish his work before he dies. So look at the morality being reflected in these lines. I take one more quote by our own Rabindranath Tagore, and look at the power, the human goodness in these lines. Let me not pray to be sheltered from dangers, but to be fearless in facing them. Let me not beg for the stilling of my pain, but for the heart to conquer it. Won't you agree with me, friends, that these lines on your screen bring out the human goodness, the human need to be courageous, to be brave, even in the worst of all circumstances? So friends, I'm sure we do agree now that as compared to other branches of learning, of knowledge, poetry definitely deserves a higher place. It is superior. Now, after establishing the greatness of poetry, Philip Sidney now comes to dealing with all the 4 attacks by Stephen Gosson. So let's go back to the slide and then see how he defends. Once again on your screen, I have put up the 4 attacks by Gosson against poetry. 1. A man could employ his time more usefully than in poetry. 2. Poetry is the mother of lies. 3. It is the nurse of abuse. And 4. Plato had rightly banished poetry from his ideal commonwealth. Let us see, friends, how is Sir Philip Sidney going to defend poetry against these 4 strong and serious attacks. Sidney replied to Gosson's charges. Number 1. Poetry is that branch of learning that moves a human being towards virtues. Hence, reading or writing of poetry is not a waste of time. Poetry is that branch of learning that moves a human being towards virtues. Hence, reading or writing of poetry is not a waste of time. I will just try to explain this a little, friends. Friends, I'm sure we have all known in our lifetime any number of great people who were perhaps very good engineers, very good doctors, very good politicians. But if these same great people, I will not call them great, but good people in their professions, were not honest, were not kind, were not giving, were not sharing, will we call them as good? Will we in fact even give them any kind of virtuous quality? I'm sure we have all come across doctors who may be good in their professions, but if they are not good human beings, then they become useless. What is Sir Philip Sidney saying? That poetry is that branch of learning which is making you and I honest, truthful, kind, generous. In other words, it is teaching us how to become virtuous. Ultimately, is that not what we desire in a human being? So, therefore, writing or reading of poetry is definitely not a wastage of time. So Stephen Gosson's attack that by you're wasting time when you're reading or writing poetry gets nullified straight away. Let's come back to the slide on the screen. Look at the second defense by Sir Philip Sidney. The question of truth and lies arises when someone deals with past or present facts. A poet does not deal with facts. He only uses facts to arrive at a higher truth. Hence, poetry certainly is not the mother of lies. This is indeed an extremely important argument against Gosson's attack that it is the mother of lies. Poetry is the mother of lies. I will just try to explain this a little, friends. We just compared history and poetry, and I made it very clear that history deals with people, geographic locations, regions, nations, countries, etc. It is history which tells us what happened with Genghis Khan, how did he rule, how did Queen Elizabeth I rule, what happened to Henry XIV, what happened to the Mughals in India, etc., etc. So history deals with facts. Therefore, any misrepresentation in history can be either correct or right or wrong on the opposite. But poetry is not telling us when did Genghis Khan rule, when did the Mughals come to India. It is not giving us in which year Queen Elizabeth I was born and when did she begin to rule rather. Poetry is not giving us facts. Poetry is just giving us virtues, values, human values. And therefore, to say that poetry is the mother of lies by Stephen Gosson is absolutely invalid. That argument itself, that attack itself is totally unjustified. So let's go back to the screen. I am sure, friends, Sir Philip Sidney has been able to answer the first two charges by Stephen Gosson very, very nicely. I'll repeat. Number one, the first attack was a man could employ his time more usefully than in poetry, and number two, poetry is the mother of lies. Look at Sidney's replies. 1. Poetry is that branch of learning that moves a human being towards virtues. Hence, reading or writing of poetry is not a waste of time. Number 2. The question of truth and lies arises when someone deals with past or present facts. A poet does not deal with facts. He only uses facts to arrive at a higher truth. Hence, poetry certainly is not the mother of lies. I will just take ourselves a slide earlier and look at the third and the fourth attacks. Number 3, poetry is the nurse of abuse. Number 4, Plato had rightly banished poetry from his ideal commonwealth. So now let's see, what does Sir Philip Sidney have to say about number 3? Sidney did agree that at times poets used cheap wit as in humor, sinfulness, and lustful love as elements in their poetry. Comedy, lyric, elegy, and epic do contain these unworthy elements. However, now this is important on your screen, friends, please pay attention. However, Sidney argues that for this, the specific poets are to be blamed, not poetry as a whole. Hence, such poets need to be avoided, not poetry. I will just try to explain this a little. Friends, what is Sidney trying to tell us? Gosson calls poetry the nurse of abuse. Sidney says, yes, there are a few poems and there are a few poets who include cheap humor, lustful love, sinful vices in their poems. For instance, I'm sure all of you listen to any number of Bollywood songs. There are any number of Bollywood songs which are extremely cheap in nature. They may appear to be a little groovy, make us dance for a while, but then they have no meaning attached. In fact, on the contrary, they simply exhibit the cheapness of humor, and they simply exhibit the lustful love and other sinful vices. So friends, these kind of songs are best ignored, avoided. But because a few Bollywood songs like these with cheapness in them are picturized, that doesn't mean that you and I reject the entire song industry of Bollywood. Songs are not to be avoided. Poets are not to be avoided. But such poets, poetry as a whole is extremely pure. Such poets have to be ignored and avoided. So, Bollywood cannot rid itself of music, lyrics and songs. It is such songs and such lyrics which simply have to be ignored and avoided. I hope that makes the point very clear. Let us go back to the slide, friends. I'll read it out again. Sidney did agree that at times poets used cheap wit, sinfulness and lustful love as elements in their poetry. Comedy, lyric, elegy and epic do contain these unworthy elements. However, Sidney argues that for this, the specific poets are to be blamed, not poetry as a whole. Hence, such poets need to be avoided, not poetry. So friends, let us come to the last charge of Stephen Gosson, that even Plato had banished all poetry from his ideal republic. What does Sir Philip Sidney say about this? Lastly, Sidney clarifies that Plato did not banish poetry at all. This is very, very important, friends. In fact, according to Plato, poetry was divinely inspirational. Instead, Plato wanted to banish those poets who abused poetry and falsely misrepresented gods and also diminished the love for the nation. So friends, on your screen, this is the last defense of Stephen Gosson's attack. And what Sir Philip Sidney is doing, he is making it very clear. Plato did not banish poetry at all. Plato also did not want such poets inside his ideal republic who would abuse gods, who would misrepresent gods, or who would give rise to false, hopeless sentiments, non-patriotic, non-nationalized sentiments for the nation. So friends, I am sure all of us, we have not only understood how beautifully and how wonderfully well Sir Philip Sidney has defended poetry against Stephen Gosson's attacks, but in fact, in the process, Sir Philip Sidney has simply succeeded and very nicely to uphold the greatness of poetry. Stephen Gosson's attacks became null and void the moment Sidney wrote Apology for Poetry. So friends, this brings us to the end of the second episode on Sir Philip Sidney. Stay tuned in at the same Goethe YouTube channel for episode number 3, where we will discuss how Sir Philip Sidney promoted classicism. Thank you friends. Have a good day.